So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Candy, and I'm based some of the time in Sydney, where I've been for the last 10 years or so, at the University of Technology. Before that, the University of Sydney. And before that, Loughborough University in England. So, I'm going to talk today about lessons that we've learnt from research. And that word research is quite important for what I'm about to say. It's not going to be quite as exciting in the visual sense as what we've seen. I apologise in advance. But I think it's quite important because that whole question about what we're actually doing in this world of art and technology collaboration needs to have also a longer view, in my opinion. So, whilst it's very important that we make things happen and that there are things to enjoy and experience, there is also the question of, well, what are we learning from it and what is it that we can pass on? So I'm going to talk about some of that work that we did in the early days and put forward some ideas about what makes a successful collaboration. This year, last year now, in Sydney, we had the Vivid Festival. Some of you were there, I think. Those of you who attended ICT-ART were able to see that. And what you would have seen is interactive art, which invaded the streets of Sydney. And this has been going on for some time. But now, when you think that perhaps 500,000 people came out and put the transport system under such pressure that it almost collapsed, that should give you an indication of how things are in the public eye when it comes to interactive digital art. And much of the work on the streets of Sydney was individual artists, design companies, architectural companies, all kinds of people who'd come together to make things happen on the streets. And of course, all these events are very important for funding. I mean, the research officers for the Australia Council were very pleased because, of course, now they could argue that there was public take-up for this kind of work, and that's very important. And I think we've now got to almost a critical mass internationally, whereby we need to stand back a bit and start to look reflectively about what it is that is actually happening here and what is it that we're actually learning. Of course, all these events teach us things. We learn through anecdotes and experience how we can move on to the next stage. What we don't often learn, and what isn't often documented, is what went wrong, what were the mistakes, what were the failures, how did we learn something from those failures? And I think that's where research comes in. Okay, and we don't really, certainly as far as I can tell, we don't seem to have many systematic ways of passing on the lessons of these collaborative ventures. Okay, so Christian's talked about some of the history. I just wanted to say the context. I'm going to go back in history now and speak about some of the things that we did in the 1990s. I won't go into all the background to the art technology history, which some of you will know about. If you don't, then it's very instructive to go back and to see how fragmented the records are, how little real knowledge we have of what went on in those collaborations back in the days of ICT and cybernetic serendipity. And of course there are PhDs going on right now uncovering that history. So as a lesson for us, one thing is a lesson to actually document and to record things. And what is it that we're documenting? Well, we were fortunate enough in England in the 1990s to have an engineering and science, physical science research council, which had an IT arm that introduced the word creativity into its research agenda. There were reasons why that happened. It was much to do with individuals who had come together and talked with people who were in the Arts Council, people like Brona Ferren, for example, people like Nigel Birch. We had early discussions which enabled us to put some of the issues to do with art technology onto the IT research agenda. And we, of course, did our history. We looked at what happened at Xerox, and Craig Harris's report on the PAIR project is very interesting, those of you who haven't read that. And what we learned was that, of course, what Xerox were trying to do was to use the invitation to artists to come in and use their technology and find out what they could do with it as a way of stimulating corporate innovative technology. And we thought that was an interesting idea. Certainly there were things that were happening that were obviously very exciting to the artists of the time, but the artists were certainly not in the driving seat. So what we tried to do was to turn that around and to put the artists in the driving seat. Now, and that led to something called the CoStart project. The CoStart project was funded by the EPSRC. I think it was the first of its kind. It may well have been the last of its kind. But in those days, it was unusual. And just thinking about what this project meant, I'm talking about the mid-90s, late 90s. We had two phases, the 1998 to 2000. Of course, there was a lot of preparation coming up to it. We had already established creativity and cognition studios at Loughborough. Loughborough at the time was a centre of HCI research, so many of the people involved were HCI researchers, and artists were already coming in, working with people in the HCI laboratories there. But CoStart represented something different, which was to take the notion of artist residencies and use those as opportunities for driving innovative ideas that would involve some form of technology. And what we have to think about here is that we had very well-equipped research studios. We had funding from the Silicon Graphics. In fact, the equipment budget was bigger than the actual budget for the research. And at the same time, we were very conscious of the fact that if we were putting artists in the driving seat, we needed to be aware of the need for exhibition spaces, etc. So it wasn't just a question of having research laboratories to do nice things with technology. So the model for CoStart was an artist-led one, and we really felt this was very important to do. It was a hypothesis, if you like, that artists would drive the technology, drive the thinking about technology in a different way. And that, of course, that proved to be the truth. So the artists proposed the ideas and the technologists were intended to respond to those challenges. And we set up artist residencies on site, dedicated time, and also provided longer term support by giving opportunities for research fellowships so that artists became fellow. That was the only model that existed within the universities, that an artist would become a fellow. But that gave them access to all the resources and just being able to come into the laboratories and do some work. And of course there was also the need for monitoring. Now we set up, and I'm actually talking to you here in terms of now looking back on what we did. We had selection criteria, and without going into too much detail, as I don't have the time to do that, just to say things like, when you set up these kinds of residencies, it's very important that artists need to understand what it is they're getting themselves into. So, for example, it was very important for artists to understand the need for self-evaluation or self-monitoring, and that was an essential part of the process. Because this was a research project, this wasn't just to create events, this was to actually gather data, try to understand what was going on. And we also wanted to have artists who had some level of experience, so that there was a selection criteria on the basis of a number of different attributes, whether their track record was significant in some way. Basically, it was in order that we didn't find ourselves mainly working with student artists. Not that we had anything against students, it's just that the whole question of experience, we wanted a range of people who had experience in the art world. So we were looking for a diversity, a representation of a range of artistic approaches and forms, and this is just to give an indication of the kinds of things that were going on. So in order for the researchers' purpose at least, to be able to accommodate as many different kinds of forms as possible. And of course that posed all kinds of challenges for them, for the the setting up the laboratories and the studios. And in phase 2, the emphasis changed towards more interaction, more sound and visual work. Okay, so there's a residency process. I don't have time to go into that in detail, but just to say this whole question about inviting artists to generate art project proposals is very important. And we gave them all a pro forma because it was very important for them to try to specify the kinds of visions that they had, but at the same time what sort of resources they needed in order that we could see whether we could match the resources to these proposals. So there was a lot of process. It's actually documented in that paper, which I can provide for anyone who's interested in going into more detail about that. And then the research topics, well, we covered art practice, the nature of art practice itself, and the role of digital technology. The technology development itself, of course, this was a HCI project. It was funded from an IT research initiative, so we needed to be able to come up with some requirements. And then the whole question of collaboration. What did it mean to collaborate between artists and technologists, whether they were artists as technologists or technologists as artists? And that we didn't know. In many ways, this was an exploratory project, quite hard to argue under the auspices of the EPSRC, because certainly in those days, if you weren't doing laboratory work, experimental studies, then that wasn't research. And we were adopting an open, more ethnographic style of research. Okay, and that involved having multiple viewpoints, artists, technologists, and observers. We were supported by fellowships from the EPSRC in addition to the grant in order to fund external observers, and we were lucky in that respect, and we had people who could act as observers as well as the researchers employed on the project. Okay, now this is quite an important, I mentioned before the artists and the technologists, certainly the artists needed to be aware of what the issue to do with research involves, and one of our, certainly artists were, some of them were quite uncomfortable about having an observer as part of their group, their project group, and where that occurred, it seemed very important to understand that the observation was not the external observer role, but that of a participative observer. And one of the lessons was that where the observer, whether the researcher, could perform some kind of useful function for the artists and technologists, then there was a higher degree of acceptance. And that, I think, is quite an important thing to understand. So resistance to having someone external in a project group could be overcome where that person appears to be useful. Okay, so we have a research process, and now I won't go into all the detail about this because, well, it's pretty dry stuff anyway. But the important thing to understand is that we were looking to find out not answers, but questions. What were the questions we needed to ask about the nature of collaboration between artists and technologists? And of course, that meant collecting data, case study data. We identified features and descriptions, compared the cases, and then we tried to identify success criteria. What was it that made a successful project? Where did the projects have less success? And then we were looking at also models of collaboration. Excuse me. Okay, so on the question of collaboration, what emerged from the data is important to understand. And we identified 3 aspects of the collaborative process that was important to consider. Firstly, what we call cognitive style. Our cognitive style, as you'll see from the list below, incorporated quite a number of aspects. This was a very broad definition of what cognitive style might mean. So whether the approach to the creative project was exploratory or was it goal-driven, what kinds of approaches were adopted by the different participants. And what was the ethic? Was it an art-led ethic? Was it a technology-led ethic that drove the collaboration? And issues like the value placed upon the level of control over the process. From the artist's point of view, how much control mattered to them in terms of making the crucial decisions. And then finally, whether the methods we used were wholly digital or combining traditional and digital. And, well, I won't go into all the details here, but obviously we were able then to apply descriptors to the data that we had. And on the question of methods, I think it's quite interesting if you're setting up a facility for art technology collaboration, one of the things that the technology environment found difficult to accommodate was the idea of wet spaces, places where you needed a tap and a sink, and doing messy things like putting ink into tanks of water, or filling condoms with water and then manipulating that in order to consider the physical modelling aspects. Now, this probably is quite an important thing. Even today, in my university in Sydney, we still have that problem. For the technologists, the desktop studio space now extends to sensor systems and interactive spaces for movement. But if you ask for a sink, they usually conclude that you want to make coffee while you're doing the work. And yet, of course, from an artist's point of view, this may well be a very important part of the process. So, just to consider this, these are some images from the Coast Art project in progress. And then, of course, on one of the other issues is to do with communication styles. Probably the most fundamental thing: how open were the participants in the sense of the way that they talked? And we had plenty of data to be able to look at the conversational style, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And what kind of exchanges were there? Were the art and technologists working together minute by minute, hour by hour, or did they just come together in an intermittent way and share ideas at various points? What kind of relationship was developing there? And how did they respond to one another's ideas? Was it affirming? Was it to ignore what they were saying and then make some suggestion? You know, the very idea of saying, well, I think this is a good idea, and then someone says, well, I think this is a good idea. And a lot of that told you a lot about the nature of the collaboration. And then, of course, it was a question of knowledge. What do the different parties bring to the collaboration itself? Things like, in a partnership of two, were there enough skills to go around for the vision of the project? And very often that was not the case. And I think this is where the university environment was extremely important, because if, for example, within a given collaboration, the necessary expertise to achieve a particular outcome wasn't available, we were able to search across the university to find somebody who had that expertise. And that's very important. It really goes back to the point that Christiane was making. How active do the people setting up art technology collaborations have to be to make sure that the artist doesn't have to do it all themselves, that there's a network of skills and people who have the necessary expertise that you can draw on. Now, it's very often underestimated, but that is what a university is. It's a massive repository of fantastic skills. And we had people from engineering, from computing, from the art department, painting department. We had people who were all interested in taking part in ways of supporting the art technology collaborations. So this is quite important to understand, that this resource that a university represents is not one to be treated as if it doesn't matter. It does matter, and it can be very important in any given initiative. Okay, so of course we did all the necessary research, comparing the cases, trying to identify what was successful across different... This is the first phase of the Coast Art project. I said it was in 2 phases. Altogether we had 20 artists in residencies, and the 2 phases we were able to learn from the first phase and feed that information. So it was an action research project in that sense. And this just sums up the kinds of ways in which we tabulated the results. And we looked at things like, what is a measure of success? Well, clearly, as there's a subjective measure, do the participants in the project believe this is successful? But we could also look at the primary data itself, that is, all the documented field notes, the artist records, the technologist records, and the video, audio records that we kept, and we could see for ourselves as researchers, those of us who played the role of researchers, whether or not the participant confidence was in fact justified. So that's important to understand, that if there is good documentation, that it isn't just a matter of believing what the artists or the technologists say. You have, not that that isn't reliable, of course, it might be enough. If the collaboration parties believe it's successful, then that is, of course, a measure of success, subjective as it is. But also we looked at what we might call more objective. I always hesitate with these terms because in scientific terms it's so contentious. What is objective, what is subjective? And when you're doing observational ethnographic research, those questions arise all the time to do with how do you know what is objective. So we decided to limit what we thought objective might mean. It would mean things like, was there a prototype system out of the collaboration? And bear in mind that although the artist residencies were technically a year long, the actual face-to-face on-site residencies were only initially a week intensive work, but a lot came out of that week, and that's quite important to understand as well. So we use things like, was a prototype created? Was there an exhibition? Did commissions arise out of the collaboration? And then we actually cross-checked those criteria against things like the cognitive style, the communication, and the knowledge use. So it's all documented in papers which I can provide anyone who's interested. And so what were we able to say about all this? What kinds of collaborative models arose? Well, we had the classic gun for hire technology artist collaboration, where this is all the little block on the left there, where the creative concept belongs to the artist, the technologist does all the work, the construction work, and the artist evaluates. And we had models like that. We have also what we called a full partnership, where all the work was done together, creative concept, construction, and evaluation. And then a variant on the partnership model, which was that the evaluation was not done by the technologist, but only by the artist. So in the interesting things about what you learn about, is an assistant model, is the gun for hire model an effective model of collaboration? Is this the way to go? Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to hurry this one. And what we found was that, yes, sometimes it was very successful, but often there were mismatches. And I don't have time to read this dialogue, but we were able to show that the attitudinal differences between the technologists and the artists were very important in the success. This mismatch here was because the technologist really didn't believe that the artist had any technology skills at all, and didn't really understand what knowledge the artist had. And that's very important, that people should share their knowledge and share their understanding, even if that knowledge is different. And then, of course, the partnership model. This was what we believed to be the basis for a longer-term relationship, and not necessarily the ones that in the first instance produced the most work. I mean, very often it was the relationship developed, but the actual output was not very significant in the first instance. So, some notions about what makes a successful artist-technologist partnership. So common vision, shared language, and this question of sustained engagement. How long after the residency did the artists and technologists continue to work together? That's very important if you're thinking about setting up networks for future work. And then, of course, when you make mistakes, do you have time to recover? And mistakes do happen, and mistakes are the fastest way you learn. Okay, so good practice. I can provide these slides for those who are interested. We documented it in this book. We subsequently took the knowledge to Sydney and set up the Beta Space, which was an operation in a public museum. What happened here was that the research lab in the university worked in conjunction with the interactive environment in the Powerhouse Museum, and this enabled artists to carry out evaluation and studies of their work with the public. And this turned out to be very important, and we have a book which documents a lot of this work, for those of you who are not aware of it. Now, this book is based upon all the work that the artist-technologists at Sydney developed and tried out in the public domain. And now, this is the current stage, which is to actually look at the evaluation process. And this book is coming out in the spring. There is an initiative going on in the HCI community through the SIG Chi conference series, and those of you who are interested, it's called Chi Arts, and there'll be some workshops and panels at Chi in Toronto this year, for those of you who would like to join in on that. Okay, I haven't got time to go into all the things, but I want us to say something about, well, what's the practitioner's view of what makes a good collaboration? And this is quite important to understand. If you look at what's at the top there, work with experienced and high caliber people. This comes from someone who is an artist and a technologist. He's not someone who just has a single label. And notice down forth that engage in reflection on all aspects of the work through conversation as interviews. So reflective practice becomes embedded in the process. And this is part of the lessons that have come out of our practice-based research that this work represents. Okay, I won't talk about why collaboration. We all think it's a great idea. The difference between collaboration and cooperation. Cooperation may be the right model, but it's a much more open-ended, fluid way of looking at partnerships and collaboration in general. And the whole question of teamwork. What is teamwork? One of the things I'm hoping that you'll be able to do this afternoon is to discuss the nature of teamwork. You know, do you need a leader who coordinates, assigns tasks, manages the process, or is that leader actually a facilitator? Or in partnership, are you equal? Do you share the actual vision? Do you actually share the ownership? And of course, that's very important. What does it mean to be an equal partner? And what artists and technologists' roles are best for successful teamwork? Well, we learnt a lot from CoStart. But of course, the technologies change, experiences change, people are now much more aware than they were 20 years ago. So we need to revisit all these questions. And when we're thinking about what do we need, when we think about teamwork, what does it mean? Well, it very often means this. You may not be planning to rob a bank, but if you are ambitious and wish to achieve something, very often it means actually taking charge. Okay? So last two slides, if I'm allowed. Yes. For artists and technologists and researchers, a few points to make here. That collaborating creatively is not easy or natural to everyone. And the question is, can you acquire the skills to work well with someone? If you feel you want to, can you acquire the skills? Do you know what it is that you need to know in order to work well with someone? When you actually think about being a part of a collaborating group, it's important to make explicit to your potential collaborators what ideas you have for collaboration. Very often these things are implicit, almost unable to be articulated. So if you want an equal partner, because it's the partnership that matters, rather than a tame assistant, then you need to be clear in your own mind. And what we saw in the CoStar project was that those artists who wanted a tame assistant got what they wanted. They were able to achieve their goals. Those who wanted a partnership didn't necessarily know what their goals were. They had some vision, but they wanted to establish a relationship for the longer term. And that's very important to understand. Is it just that you want to make a particular installation, you want to get it out there, you want to win a commission, you want to get a grant? Be clear in your own head. And then, third point, being focused on your own vision and at the same time being open to ideas from a collaborating partner is a hard balance to strike. That's what we discovered from our research. So the question really boils down to how willing are you to genuinely share? And do you understand the implications of what sharing means? And that means not just the ideas and the artworks, but the ownership, the reputation, the publicity. Okay, and for the organisers, last slide. For the organisers, well, this is quite important, I think. If you have goals that are, I don't say you're deliberately trying to hide, but they're implicit, they're not explicit to the participants, and you need to make them so. What do you expect to achieve by supporting collaborative projects? Have you articulated that very clearly and in detail? And are those objectives clear to everybody who gets involved? We found that we weren't clear enough. That's why that question is there. And selecting candidate project requires much more than serendipity, and this is a good person to work with. It has to be much more clearly specified. Have you made the selection criteria explicit? What kind of resources do you have to support each project, etc.? And finally, of course, my pet project is evaluation. Evaluate, evaluate, evaluate. This doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. You may think it happens because you're assessing the outcome, but it's evaluating the process that is very important. And it's process over outcomes that we can all learn from, because we can argue about whether the outcome is a good one or not. We can argue whether we've liked that experience, whatever. But can we learn from other people's process that would enable us to achieve our own outcomes? And that's the question of evaluation. Okay, so that's me. And lots of reading for those who want to.